The summer of 1923 burned hotter than most in Copper Ridge, Montana. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water over the wheat fields and turned the dirt roads into ribbons of dust that clung to everything: boots, wagon wheels, hope itself. It was the kind of season that tested a person's mettle, separating the strong from the desperate, the righteous from the cruel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the heart of this unforgiving landscape, where the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the endless sky, a young woman named Isabella Rodriguez found herself cast out from the only world she had ever known. At 19, with dark hair that caught the sunlight like spun bronze and eyes that held the weight of unspoken sorrows, she carried more than just the burden of her swollen belly. She carried the shame of a family's honor, the sting of rejection, and the terrible knowledge that in a world ruled by men's judgments, a woman's worth could be measured in whispers and sideways glances. The Rodriguez family had once been respected. In Copper Ridge, Isabella's father, Miguel, had worked the copper mines for 15 years, his hands scarred by honest labor, his back bent by the weight of providing for his wife and 3 daughters. Her mother, Carmen, had been known throughout the town for her intricate embroidery and the way she could stretch a dollar until it screamed. They had been a family of modest means but considerable pride, the kind of pride that built churches and raised children who said, "Yes, sir," and "No, mum," without being reminded. But pride, Isabella had learned, was a double-edged sword. It could lift a family up or cut them down, depending on which way the wind was blowing. And when the wind carried news of her condition, unmarried, unashamed, and unwilling to name the father, that same pride had turned sharp as a blade. The confrontation had come on a Tuesday morning, when the heat was already pressing down like a wool blanket and the flies buzzed lazy circles around the kitchen table. Isabella had been kneading dough for the day's bread, her movements careful and deliberate, despite the growing awkwardness of her changing body. The morning sickness had finally passed, leaving her with an appetite that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Her father had entered the kitchen with the heavy steps of a man carrying bad news. Behind him came Father Martinez from the parish church, his black robe somehow making the small room feel even smaller. The priest's face was set in the kind of expression that had been perfected over decades of delivering uncomfortable truths to uncomfortable families. "Mia," her father had said, his voice rough as sandpaper, "we need to talk." Isabella had continued kneading, her hands working the dough with increasing force. She had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since the first morning she had retched into the basin behind the house. But knowing and being ready were two different things entirely. "The whole town knows," Father Martinez had said, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "They're talking, Isabella. About you, about your family. About what kind of home allows such behavior." Her mother had stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her hands twisted in her apron. Carmen Rodriguez had aged 10 years in the past 3 months, the lines around her eyes deepening with each whispered conversation at the market, each pointed look from the other women at Mass. "You have to understand," her father had continued, his accent thickening with emotion, "I've worked my whole life to build something here, to give you girls a chance at decent lives, and now—" He had gestured helplessly at her belly, as if the sight of it explained everything that needed explaining. Isabella had finally looked up from her dough, her hands stilling. "And now what, Papa? Now you're ashamed of me? Now I'm not your daughter anymore?" The silence that followed had been deafening. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than shouting, that confirmed fears and sealed fates. Father Martinez had cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a church bell tolling the hour. "There's a place," he had said carefully, "run by the sisters in Denver. They take in girls in your ... situation. You could have the baby there, quietly. Give it to a good family. Come back when it's over and start fresh. Isabella had laughed then, a sound bitter as burnt coffee. Start fresh? Like nothing happened? Like I can just pretend that I didn't carry this child for 9 months. Didn't feel it moving inside me, didn't. Enough, her father had said, his voice sharp as a whip crack. You made your choice when you did what you did. Now, you have to live with the consequences. The argument that followed had been years in the making. All the small rebellions, all the questions about why her brothers got to stay out late while she had to be home by dark, all the time she had bitten her tongue when told that a good girl didn't think such thoughts or dream such dreams. It had all come pouring out in that overheated kitchen, with the smell of yeast and disappointment hanging heavy in the air. Isabella had thrown the dough aside, flour coating her hands like dust from a grave. My choice? When did I get to choose? Anything? When did any of us get to choose? You chose my job, my friends, my future. The only thing I chose was to love someone who couldn't love me back the way I deserved. Her mother had sobbed then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Isabella, please. Think about your sisters. Think about Maria and Sophia. If you stay, if people keep talking, what kind of chances will they have? That had been the blow that found its mark. Isabella had looked at her mother, really looked at her, and seen the desperation there. The fear that one daughter's mistake would damn them all. In a town like Copper Ridge, reputations were fragile things, easily shattered and nearly impossible to repair. She nodded slowly, her hands moving to rest on her belly. I see, so I'm the sacrifice. The one who has to disappear so the family can pretend they're still respectable. Father Martinez had stepped forward then, his voice gentle but firm. It's not about sacrifice, child. It's about redemption. About making things right. Isabella had looked at him with eyes that seemed suddenly older than her 19 years. Right for who, Father? For the father who won't even acknowledge what he did. For the town that would rather see me disappear than face the truth about what happens to girls who trust the wrong men. Or right for a family that would rather lose a daughter than lose face. The next few hours had passed in a blur of tearful arguments and whispered negotiations. Her father had offered to pay for her passage to Denver, to make arrangements with the sisters. Her mother had packed a small bag with her few belongings, her hands shaking as she folded Isabella's dresses and tried to imagine a world where her eldest daughter simply ... wasn't. But Isabella had other plans. She had been thinking about this moment for weeks, planning for the possibility that her family's love might prove conditional. She had saved every penny she could from her work at the general store, hiding the money in a tin box beneath her bed. She had studied the train schedules and the maps, looking for places where a girl could disappear without having to give up the child she already loved more than her own life. When the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to mock the darkness of the day, Isabella had made her decision. She had kissed her mother goodbye, embraced her father with forgiveness she didn't quite feel, and walked out the front door of the only home she had ever known. But instead of heading toward the train station and the ticket to Denver that her father had pressed into her hand, she had turned toward the outskirts of town, toward the wild country where the rules were different and a person could remake themselves, if they had the courage to try. The first 3 days had been the hardest. She had walked along the dusty roads, her small suitcase growing heavier with each mile, her belly making every step a reminder of why she was out there alone. She had slept in abandoned barns and washed her face in creek water, eating the bread and cheese her mother had packed and trying not to think about what would happen when the food ran out. It was on the 4th day that she had met Marcus Shaw, a traveling salesman with kind eyes and a weakness for sob stories. He had been heading west in his wagon, loaded down with patent medicines and promises of miracle cures. When he had seen her walking alone on the road, dust-covered and obviously with a child, he had stopped without hesitation. "Miss," he had called out, tipping his hat, "you look like you could use a ride." Isabella had been wary at first. She had learned the hard way that kindness from strangers often came with strings attached, but Marcus had been different. He had helped her into the wagon with gentle hands and asked no questions about her condition or her destination. He had shared his lunch and his water, and when she had finally told him she was looking for work, he had nodded as if that were the most natural thing in the world. "I know a place," he had said, his voice thoughtful. "About 2 days' ride from here. Fellow named Jeremiah Blackwood runs a pig farm. Big operation, always needing help. He's got a reputation for being fair with his workers, and he doesn't ask too many questions about a person's past." Isabella had felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. What kind of work? Cooking mostly, cleaning, taking care of the books. Jeremiah's getting on in years, and he's been looking for someone to help run the household side of things. The pay's decent, and there's a room over the kitchen that comes with the job. It had seemed too good to be true, but Isabella had learned to grab onto hope wherever she found it. She had agreed to let Marcus take her to the Blackwood farm, and they had spent the next 2 days traveling through a country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile. Marcus had been good company, full of stories from his travels and observations about the changing world. He had talked about the cities he had visited, the inventions he had seen, the ways that life was becoming easier for some people and harder for others. He had spoken of women who were beginning to work in offices and factories, who were cutting their hair short and speaking their minds in ways that would have scandalized their grandmothers. "Times are changing," he had said one evening as they had camped by a stream, the sound of running water mixing with the calls of night birds. "Maybe not fast enough for some, but they're changing. A woman like you, with intelligence and determination, might find more opportunities than you think." Isabella had wanted to believe him, but she had also learned to be careful with hope. It had a way of turning sharp when you least expected it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When they had finally reached the Blackwood farm, Isabella had been struck by the size of the operation. The main house had been a sprawling structure of weathered wood and stone, surrounded by barns and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and hard work. The pig pens had stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with animals that looked well-fed and healthy. Jeremiah Blackwood had emerged from the house as their wagon had pulled up, and Isabella had felt her heart sink. He had been a tall man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of build that came from years of physical labor. But it had been his eyes that had caught her attention cold, calculating, with a hardness that had made her skin crawl. Marcus had made the introductions, explaining that Isabella was looking for work and would be perfect for the household position. They had discussed. Jeremiah had looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her belly with an expression that had made her want to pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Well, well," he had said, his voice carrying an undertone that had made Isabella's stomach clench. "A girl in your condition, looking for work. How convenient." Marcus had seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. "Now, Jeremiah, I told you she was a good worker. Honest, reliable." "Oh, I'm sure she is," Jeremiah had interrupted, his smile never reaching his eyes. "The question is what kind of work she's really looking for." Isabella had felt the heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm looking for honest work, Mr. Blackwood. Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. I'm not afraid of hard work." Jeremiah had laughed, a sound that had made her think of rustling leaves and winter wind. "Of course you're not. Girls in your situation rarely are. Tell me, who's the father of that child you're carrying?" "Some married man who promised you the moon and left you to face the consequences alone. The question had been like a slap across the face. Isabella had lifted her chin, trying to maintain some dignity. "My personal business is my own, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here about a job, nothing more." "Everything about you is my business if you're going to be working on my property," he had replied, his voice hardening. "I run a respectable operation here. I can't have damaged goods causing trouble with my other workers." Marcus had stepped forward then, his own voice carrying a warning. "That's enough, Jeremiah. The girl's looking for honest work, and you need help. Seems like a fair trade to me." "But—" Jeremiah had been unmoved. "Fair trade? Look at her, Marcus. She's carrying a bastard child, probably hasn't got 2 pennies to rub together, and she's desperate enough to come out here to the middle of nowhere looking for work. She's not in any position to be making demands." Isabella had felt the tears, threatening to fall, but she had held them back through sheer force of will. She had not come this far to break down in front of a man who clearly saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be used or discarded. "I may be desperate," she had said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "but I'm not stupid. I know what honest work looks like, and I know what it doesn't look like. If you're not interested in hiring me for the position Mr. Shaw described, then I'll be on my way." Jeremiah had laughed again, that same unsettling sound. "Oh, you'll be on your way, will you? And where exactly will you go?" "Back to whatever family threw you out. To some other farm where they'll take one look at you and reach the same conclusions I have?" The truth of his words had hit her like a physical blow. She had looked at Marcus, hoping for support, but had seen the discomfort in his eyes. He had meant well, but he was a businessman first, and he wasn't about to burn bridges with a customer over a girl he barely knew. "I'll give you a job," Jeremiah had said finally, his voice taking on a mock-generous tone. "But it won't be in the house. You'll work in the barns with the pigs. You'll muck out the pens, fill the feeding troughs, and do whatever else needs doing. The pay will be room and board, and you'll sleep in the barn with the animals where you belong." Isabella had felt the world tilting around her. This was not the opportunity Marcus had described. This was something else entirely, something that made her skin crawl and her instincts scream warnings. "And if I refuse?" she had asked, though she had already known the answer. Jeremiah had shrugged. "Then you can walk back to town and explain to the sheriff why you were trespassing on my property. I'm sure he'll be very interested in hearing about a pregnant girl wandering around the countryside, probably looking to steal from honest folks." The threat had been clear. Isabella had found herself trapped between bad choices and worse ones, with no allies and no resources. She had looked at Marcus one more time, but he had already begun loading his wagon, his discomfort with the situation evident in every movement. "I'll take the job," she had said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Jeremiah had smiled then, an expression that had made her blood run cold. "Excellent. I knew you'd see the reason. Now, let's get you settled in your new home." He had led her to a barn that housed some of the older pigs, animals that had been past their prime for breeding but were still being fattened for market. The smell had been overwhelming, a mixture of hay, manure, and something else that she couldn't quite identify, but that made her stomach turn. "This is where you'll sleep," he had said, gesturing to a small space that had been partitioned off with rough boards. "There's a cot and a blanket. You'll take your meals in the kitchen, but you'll eat after the other workers are finished. And you'll keep your mouth shut about your situation. The last thing I need is you causing trouble with talk about your bastard child." Isabella had nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had set her suitcase down on the rickety cot and tried not to think about how far she had fallen in such a short time. "Work starts at dawn," Jeremiah had continued. "You'll muck out the pens first, then feed the animals. After that, you'll do whatever else needs doing. And Isabella?" He had paused at the entrance to her makeshift room. "Remember that you're Here because I'm generous enough to give you a chance. Cross me, and you'll find yourself on the road again, with nothing but the clothes on your back." As his footsteps had faded away, Isabella had sunk onto the cot and finally allowed herself to cry. She had cried for the family that had cast her out, for the dreams that had died in a kitchen filled with flour and disappointment. She had cried for the child she carried, who would be born into a world that had already judged them both. And she had cried for herself, for the girl who had believed that love could conquer all, who had trusted in the wrong person and was now paying the price. The pigs had stirred restlessly in their pens, as if sensing her distress. One of them, an old sow with intelligent eyes, had approached the partition and snuffled at the boards, making soft sounds that had almost seemed like comfort. "At least you don't judge," Isabella had whispered to the animal. "At least you don't care that I'm carrying a child whose father will never acknowledge him." As the sun had set and the barn had grown dark, Isabella had tried to imagine what the next few months would hold. She had tried to picture herself growing larger with a child while working in the pig pens, tried to imagine giving birth in this place that smelled of animals and desperation, but mostly she had tried to hold on to the hope that somehow, someway, things would get better. That this was not the end of her story, but just a chapter in a book that was still being written. She had placed her hands on her belly and whispered promises to the child growing inside her, promises that she would find a way to give them both a better life, that she would not let the circumstances of their birth define their future. The pigs had settled into sleep around her, their breathing creating a rhythm that was oddly comforting. And as Isabella had finally drifted off to sleep on the narrow cot, she had dreamed of a future where she and her child were valued for who they were, not judged for how they came to be. But first, she would have to survive the months ahead in a place where she was seen as less than human, working for a man who clearly had his own dark purposes. The real test of her strength was just beginning, and she could only hope that when it was over, she would still recognize the person she had been before the world had tried to break her. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over the Blackwood farm, creeping through the gaps in the barn walls like an unwelcome visitor. Isabella woke to the sound of pigs grunting and shuffling in their pens, their restless movements accompanied by the distant clanging of metal buckets and the sharp whistle of wind through loose boards. Her body ached from sleeping on the thin mattress, and the smell that had seemed overwhelming the night before now felt like a living thing, pressing against her lungs with each breath. She sat up slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the child stirred with gentle kicks. At 6 months pregnant, her movements had become careful and deliberate, each position calculated to minimize discomfort. The baby seemed more active in the mornings, as if responding to the changing light that filtered through the dusty windows. The sound of heavy boots on wooden planks announced Jeremy's approach. Isabella quickly smoothed her hair and adjusted her dress, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite her surroundings. The partition door swung open without ceremony, and Jeremy stood there with a bucket in one hand and a pitchfork in the other. "Time to earn your keep," he said, his voice carrying the same cold authority from the day before. "The pigs don't feed themselves, and I don't tolerate laziness from anyone under my roof, even someone sleeping with the animals." Isabella rose carefully, using the wall for support. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Jeremy's laugh was harsh. "As gravel, what do I want you to do? I want you to remember your place. You're not a guest here, girl. You're barely a worker. You're something I'm tolerating because it amuses me to see how far someone can fall." He thrust the bucket toward her, the metal handle cold against her palm. "Start with the feeding. Each pen gets 2 scoops of slop from the trough outside. Don't overfeed them, waste costs money, and money comes out of your pay. Not that you'll be seeing much pay anyway, considering room and board." Isabella took the bucket, its weight surprising her. "How many pens are there?" 43 on this side of the barn, 37 on the other." You'll do them all before breakfast then. Come back and muck out the dirty ones. After that, we'll see what other work needs doing." He paused, studying her face with an expression that made her skin crawl. "And Isabella? That baby you're carrying doesn't excuse you from anything. Pregnant or not, you'll pull your weight. Or you'll find yourself on the road with nothing." The first hour was a baptism by fire. The slop bucket grew heavier with each pen, and the mixture of kitchen scraps, grain, and water sloshed against her dress as she moved from one enclosure to the next. The pigs rushed toward her each time she appeared, their massive bodies pressing against the fence rails with surprising force. Some of them were gentle, waiting patiently as she poured their food into the troughs. Others were aggressive, pushing and shoving each other in their eagerness to eat. Isabella learned quickly to stay alert. A sow named Bertha, according to the nameplate on her pen, had a tendency to charge the fence whenever someone approached. The first time it happened, Isabella stumbled backward, nearly dropping the bucket and sending slop splashing across her shoes. The second time, she was ready, speaking softly to the animal while keeping a safe distance. "Easy, girl," she murmured, surprised to find comfort in the sound of her own voice. "I know you're hungry. We're all hungry for something." By the time she finished the feeding, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the barnyard. Her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and her feet throbbed in her worn boots, but there was no time to rest. Jeremiah appeared again, this time carrying a shovel and wearing an expression of barely contained irritation. "Took you long enough," he said, checking his pocket watch with theatrical disapproval. "The other workers finished their morning chores an hour ago. Maybe tomorrow you'll move a little faster." Isabella wanted to point out that the other workers weren't 6 months pregnant and sleeping in a pig barn, but she bit her tongue. She had learned long ago that defending herself often made situations worse, not better. Which pens need cleaning? She asked instead. Jeremiah pointed to a section of the barn where the smell was particularly intense. "Start there and work your way down. The wheelbarrow's by the door. You'll need it to haul the muck to the compost pile behind the barn, and make sure you spread fresh straw when you're done. These animals are worth more than you are, so treat them accordingly." The work was backbreaking. Each pen required her to navigate around animals that weighed several times what she did, shoveling out soiled straw and manure while trying to avoid being knocked over. The pigs seemed curious about her presence, some of them following her movements, with intelligent eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of human expressions. One pig in particular caught her attention, a young boar with distinctive black spots across his pink skin. Unlike the others, he didn't rush to the food trough or try to knock her down for attention. Instead, he watched her work with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally making soft sounds that were almost conversational. "You're a strange one, aren't you?" Isabella said to him during a brief rest, leaning against the shovel handle. "Not like the others." The pig tilted his head as if considering her words, then approached the fence with cautious steps. When he reached the rails, he stood quietly, allowing Isabella to see the intelligence in his dark eyes. "I'll call you Winston," she decided impulsively. "You look like Winston to me." It was a small thing, naming the pig, but it gave her a sense of control in a situation where she had precious little. If she was going to be living here, working among these animals, she might as well try to find some connection to them. Morning stretched into the afternoon with relentless monotony. After the pens were cleaned, Jeremiah found other tasks: repairing fence posts, hauling water to distant troughs, cleaning equipment that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in months. Each job seemed designed to test her limits, to see how much she could endure before breaking. It was during the water hauling that she met the other workers for the first time. 3 men emerged from the far barn as she struggled with a heavy bucket, their conversation stopping abruptly when they noticed her. The oldest of the 3, A weather-beaten man with gray stubble and calloused hands approached first. "You must be the new girl Jeremiah mentioned," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind. "Name's Frank Morrison. Been working here for about 5 years." Isabella set down the bucket gratefully, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Isabella Rodriguez. I just started yesterday." Frank's eyes moved to her belly, then back to her face without judgment. "Pregnant women don't usually end up doing barn work. You must have some story." Before Isabella could respond, one of the younger men spoke up. "Maybe she's one of those girls who got herself in trouble and came looking for easy work." His voice carried a sneer that made Isabella's cheeks burn. "That's enough, Pete," Frank said sharply. "Whatever brought her here is her business, not ours." The third man, somewhere between Frank's age and Pete's, nodded in agreement. "Frank's right. We all got our reasons for being here. Best to leave each other's stories alone." He extended a work-roughened hand. "I'm David Chun. Welcome to the farm, I suppose." Isabella shook his hand, grateful for the show of basic human decency. It was more than she had received from Jeremiah, and it reminded her that not everyone in this place saw her as something less than human. "How long have you been working for Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. David and Frank exchanged a look that Isabella couldn't quite interpret. "Long enough to know the rules," David said carefully. "Work hard, keep your head down, and don't ask too many questions. That's how you survive here," Pete snorted. "Survive? Is that what we're calling it?" "I call it earning an honest living, unlike some people who show up looking for handouts." Frank turned on the younger man with surprising speed. "I said that's enough. You got something to say about how Jeremiah runs his business, you take it. Up with him. Otherwise, keep your opinions to yourself." Pete held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, fine. Just saying what everyone's thinking." As the men walked away, Isabella heard Pete mutter something about fallen women and knowing their place. The words stung, but she was beginning to develop a thick skin when it came to such comments. She had heard worse from her own family. After all, the rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though Isabella could feel eyes on her as she worked. Some of the farm hands seemed curious about her presence, while others appeared openly hostile. She began to understand that her situation was unusual even for a place like this, where people with limited options often ended up. It was near evening when the real trouble began. Isabella had just finished spreading fresh straw in the last pen when she heard voices approaching the barn. Jeremiah's voice was among them, along with 2 others she didn't recognize. "Double quotes ... told you I had something special," Jeremiah was saying. "A girl in her condition, willing to work for practically nothing. Might be useful for more than just farm work, if you catch my meaning." Isabella's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the wall of the pen, hoping to remain unseen, but knowing that discovery was inevitable. The voices grew closer, and she could hear the scrape of boots on the wooden floor. "She clean?" asked one of the unfamiliar voices, rough and gravelly. "Clean enough," Jeremiah replied. "And desperate. That's the important thing. Desperate people don't ask questions, don't make demands. They take what they're given and thank you for it." Isabella's mind raced. She thought about running, but where could she go? The barn had only 2 exits, and both led to the yard where other workers might see her. She thought about confronting them, but what would be the point? She had no allies. Here, no one who would stand up for her against whatever Jeremiah had planned. The voices stopped just outside the pen where she was working. Isabella forced herself to continue spreading straw, trying to look busy and hoping they would pass by without noticing her. "There she is," Jeremiah said, and Isabella knew her hope was in vain. "Isabella, come over here. I want you to meet some friends of mine." Isabella straightened slowly, the pitchfork still in her hands. The 2 men with Jeremiah looked exactly like what she had expected, rough, unshaven, with the kind of eyes that undressed a woman from across a room. One was tall and thin, with greasy black hair, the other shorter and stockier with arms that looked like tree trunks. "Gentlemen," Jeremiah said with mock formality, "allow me to introduce Isabella. Isabella, these are business associates of mine, Mr. Crawford and Mr. Hayes. They're always looking for additional services." Crawford, the tall one, smiled in a way that made Isabella's skin crawl. Well, Jeremiah wasn't exaggerating. "You're a pretty little thing, aren't you? Even in your current condition." Hayes laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "I don't mind a woman with some extra curves. Shows she knows how to enjoy herself." Isabella gripped the pitchfork tighter, her knuckles white with tension. "I don't know what you gentlemen think you're here for, but I'm just a farm worker, nothing more." Jeremiah's expression hardened. "You're whatever I say you are, girl. And right. Now I'm saying you might want to be a little more accommodating to my friends here. They're considering making a significant investment in the farm, and I like to make sure my investors are satisfied." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Isabella looked from one man to the other, seeing the hunger in their eyes, the assumption that she was nothing more than property to be used as Jeremiah saw fit. "No," she said quietly, but with steel in her voice. "I won't do it. You can fire me, you can throw me out, but I won't be what you're asking me to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Crawford's smile faded, replaced by something uglier. Hayes cracked his knuckles in a way that suggested he was used to getting his way through violence. And Jeremiah looked like a man who had just been challenged in front of witnesses and didn't intend to let it stand. "Is that so?" he said softly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout could have. "You think you're in a position to say no to me? You think you have choices here?" Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground. "Everyone has choices. Even me." What happened next would haunt her for weeks afterward. Jeremiah nodded to Crawford and Hayes, some unspoken communication passing between them. The two men moved toward her with practiced coordination, clearly used to working together to intimidate or worse. Isabella raised the pitchfork, her pregnant belly making her movements awkward, but her determination absolute. "Stay back. I mean it." Crawford laughed. "Look at that, Hayes. The little farm girl thinks she's going to fight us off with a pitchfork. How adorable." They rushed her simultaneously, one from each side. Isabella swung the pitchfork wildly, managing to catch Crawford in the shoulder with the tines. He yelped and stumbled backward, blood seeping through his shirt, but Hayes was faster and stronger. He grabbed the pitchfork from her hands and tossed it aside like it weighed nothing. His massive hands seized her arms, holding her immobile while Crawford recovered from his wound. "You little wildcat," Crawford snarled, examining the tears in his shirt. "You're going to pay for that." Jeremiah watched the struggle with cold satisfaction. "I tried to do this the easy way, Isabella. But you had to make it difficult. Now we'll do it my way." What followed was a blur of violence and humiliation that Isabella's mind would later try to forget. They dragged her from the barn toward one of the pig pens, her protests and struggles meaning nothing against their combined strength. The other farm workers were nowhere to be seen, whether by chance or design. Isabella would never know. The pen they chose was one of the smaller ones, housing a group of younger pigs who scattered in alarm as the gate swung open. The ground was soft with mud and manure, the smell overwhelming even by the standards of the farm. "This is where animals belong," Jeremiah said as they forced her to her knees in the muck. "And that's all you are, Isabella. An animal who forgot her place." They held her down while the reality of her situation sank in. She was alone, friendless, and at the mercy of men who saw her as less than human. The child in her belly moved restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and Isabella found herself whispering apologies to the life she carried. "I'm sorry," she murmured through tears and mud. "I'm so sorry I brought you into this world." Crawford wiped blood from his shoulder and glared down at her. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before fighting back. Jaramir's giving you a place to stay and work to do. The least you can do is show some gratitude." They left her there as the sun began to set, kneeling in the pig pen with her dress torn and mud caked in her hair. The young pigs had grown accustomed to her presence and had begun to approach cautiously, their snouts investigating this new addition to their domain. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to find some reserve of strength, some well of dignity that hadn't been contaminated by what had just happened. She thought about her child, about the promise she had made to give them both a better life. That promise felt hollow now, crushed under the weight of cruel reality. But as she knelt therein, the gathering darkness, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life, something unexpected happened. One of the pigs, a small female with intelligent eyes, approached her and settled down nearby, as if offering companionship. Others followed, creating a circle of warm bodies around her that provided some comfort against the evening chill. And in that moment, surrounded by animals who showed her more kindness than the humans in her life, Isabella made a new promise. She would survive this. She would endure whatever cruelty Jaramir and his associates could devise. And somehow, some way, she would find a path to something better. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, indifferent witnesses to human suffering and resilience alike. Isabella Rodriguez, broken but not defeated, closed her eyes and began planning her survival in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella's humiliation in the pig pen. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. The bruises on her arms had faded from purple to yellow-green, but the deeper wounds to her spirit remained raw and tender. She had learned to navigate Jaramir's moods, to anticipate his cruelties, and to find small pockets of safety in a world that seemed designed to crush her. The work had grown harder as her pregnancy progressed. At 7 months, her belly had become unwieldy, throwing off her balance and making simple tasks feel monumental. Yet Jaramir showed no mercy, piling on additional duties whenever he thought she was getting comfortable. She cleaned stables, hauled feed, and endured the sneers of Crawford and Hayes whenever they visited the farm for their business meetings. But Isabella had discovered something unexpected among the pigs, a kind of peace she had never known among humans. The animals didn't judge her condition or whisper about her past. They simply accepted her presence, some even seeming to offer comfort when her spirits were lowest. Winston, the spotted boar she had named, had become particularly attached to her, often approaching the fence when she worked nearby and making soft sounds that seemed almost like conversation. The other farm workers had settled into an uneasy routine around her. Frank Morrison remained quietly sympathetic, occasionally leaving extra food near her sleeping area or finding small ways to make her work easier. David Chun had proven similarly kind, though more cautious about showing it openly. Pete, on the other hand, had grown increasingly hostile, emboldened by Jaramir's treatment of her, and apparently viewing her presence as some kind of personal affront. It was Pete who brought news of the stranger on that fog-wrapped morning in late October. Isabella had been mucking out the farrowing pens when she heard his excited voice carrying across the barnyard. "Jaramir, you better come see this. There's a man at the gate, says he's looking for work. But he ain't like the usual drifters we get." Isabella paused in her work, drawn by something in Pete's tone. It wasn't often that anything disrupted the monotonous rhythm of farm life, and the prospect of any change, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Through the gaps in the barn walls, she could see a figure standing at the main gate. Even at a distance, he cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence that seemed out of place among the desperate men who usually sought work at the Blackwood farm. His clothes were travel-worn but well-made, and he carried himself like a man accustomed to respect, Jeremiah emerged from the house, his expression immediately suspicious. The stranger had removed his hat and stood waiting with patient politeness. But there was something in his posture that suggested he wouldn't be easily intimidated. Isabella found herself moving closer to the fence, drawn by curiosity despite her better judgment. Something about the man seemed different from the others who had passed through the farm, different in a way that made her heart beat faster without quite understanding why. "Help you with something?" Jeremiah called out, not bothering to approach the gate. The stranger's voice carried clearly in the still air, deep and measured. "Name's Samuel Harrison. I'm looking for farm work, specifically. I've got experience with livestock, crops, whatever needs doing." "Got plenty of workers already," Jeremiah replied curtly. "Don't need any more." Samuel nodded as if he had expected this response. "I understand, but I'm not asking for charity. I'm willing to work for room and board until I prove my worth. After that, we can discuss proper wages." There was something in his tone that suggested he was used to negotiating from a position of strength, even when circumstances put him at a disadvantage. Isabella found herself studying his face, noting the strong jaw and steady eyes that never wavered under Jeremiah's hostile stare. "Where are you from?" Jeremiah demanded. "And why aren't you working somewhere better than a pig farm in the middle of nowhere?" Samuel's expression didn't change, but Isabella caught a flicker of something pain, perhaps, or regret that crossed his features so quickly she might have imagined it. "I've been traveling for a while," he said simply. "Sometimes a man needs to find a place where he can start fresh, away from complications." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella recognized the tone because she had used it herself, the careful evasion of someone with secrets they couldn't afford to share. Jeremiah studied the stranger for a long moment, clearly calculating whether this man could be useful to him. Isabella had seen that look before, the cold assessment of how much pain could be inflicted and how much labor extracted before someone broke completely. "What kind of complications?" Jeremiah asked, stepping closer to the gate. Samuel met his gaze steadily. "The kind that are nobody's business but my own." The silence stretched between them, a test of wills that Isabella watched with growing fascination. Most men wilted under Jeremiah's stare, but Samuel stood his ground with quiet dignity that reminded Isabella of something she had almost forgotten existed in the world. Finally, Jeremiah laughed, that harsh sound Isabella had come to dread. "I like a man with secrets. Means he's got reasons to stay put and keep his mouth shut." He unlocked the gate and swung it open. "You can stay. But understand this, I run this place, and what I say goes. You work when I tell you to work, you eat when I tell you to eat, and you keep your nose out of things that don't concern you." Samuel nodded and stepped through the gate. "Understood, Frank." Jeremiah shouted toward the barns. "Get over here and show our new friend the ropes. Put him in the bunkhouse with the other men." Frank Morrison appeared from behind the equipment shed, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression when he saw Samuel was one of surprise mixed with something that might have been relief. "Frank Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the Blackwood farm." "Samuel Harrison." The handshake looked firm and sincere. "Appreciate the welcome." As Frank led Samuel toward the bunkhouse, Isabella found herself following their progress with hungry eyes. It had been so long since she had seen simple human decency that witnessing it felt like watching a miracle. The way Samuel walked, the way he spoke to Frank as an equal rather than a superior or inferior, it reminded her that there were still people in the world who hadn't forgotten how to treat others with basic respect. But she forced herself to turn away and return to her work. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had learned the hard way that expecting kindness from strangers only led to deeper disappointment. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, though Isabella found her attention drifting toward the sounds of Samuel being shown around the farm. She heard Frank's voice explaining the layout of the buildings, the feeding schedules, the temperaments of the various animals. Samuel asked intelligent questions and made observations that suggested genuine experience with farm work. It was during the noon meal that Isabella got her first close look at the newcomer. The farm hands ate in shifts, with Isabella taking her meals after everyone else had finished. But as she approached the kitchen building, she nearly collided with Samuel as he emerged from the door. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, stepping aside to give her room. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Isabella looked up at him, momentarily speechless. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had apologized to her for anything, and the simple courtesy hit her like a physical blow. Up close, she could see that Samuel was probably in his early 30s, with brown hair that showed premature, threads of silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. There were lines around those eyes that spoke of experience with both laughter and sorrow. It's fine," she managed to say, acutely aware of her own appearance. Her dress was stained with mud and pig manure, her hair hung in greasy strings, and she probably smelled like the barn she slept in. Samuel's gaze moved to her swollen belly, then back to her face without the judgment or disgust she had come to expect. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "You look like you could use some rest." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Isabella felt tears threatening and fought them back with desperate determination. She couldn't afford to break down in front of this stranger, no matter how gentle his manner seemed. "I'm fine," she said, trying to move past him toward the kitchen, but Samuel didn't move aside immediately. "What's your name?" he asked. Isabella hesitated. Giving her name felt like an act of trust she wasn't sure she could afford. But something in his expression encouraged honesty. "Isabella," she said finally. "Isabella." He repeated her name like he was tasting it, finding it worthy of respect. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Samuel." "I heard." She gestured toward the kitchen. "I need to. They don't like it when I'm late for meals." Samuel stepped aside then, but his expression had grown thoughtful. "Of course. I'll see you around, Isabella." As she entered the kitchen and ladled cold stew into a bowl, Isabella found herself replaying the conversation. Such a simple exchange, yet it had been the first time in weeks that someone had spoken to her like she was a human being rather than an inconvenience to be tolerated. The afternoon brought new challenges as Jeremiah decided to test Samuel's abilities. Isabella watched from the pig pens as the newcomer was put through a series of increasingly difficult tasks: repairing fence posts, moving heavy feed sacks, handling some of the more aggressive animals. To her surprise, Samuel met each challenge with competent skill and unflappable calm. It was his interaction with the animals that caught Isabella's attention most strongly. Unlike many of the farm hands who treated the pigs as merely livestock to be fed and cleaned up after, Samuel seemed to genuinely observe them as individuals. She watched him spend several minutes talking softly to a particularly temperamental sow, his movements patient and respectful until the animal allowed him to approach her pen. "Interesting technique," Pete's voice cut through her observation. Startling her back to awareness, Isabella turned to find Pete watching her with an unpleasant smile. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do. You've been watching our new friend all day, like a starving dog looking at a piece of meat." Pete stepped closer, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper. "But don't get any ideas, Isabella. Men like that don't want anything to do with used goods like you." The words hit their mark as Pete had intended. Isabella felt heat flood her cheeks, a mixture of shame and anger that made her hands tremble. "I was just working," she said, turning back to the pen she had been cleaning. "Were you?" Pete laughed. "Because it looked like you were dreaming about something you'll never have." "Face facts, girl, you're carrying another man's bastard. You sleep with pigs, and you smell like them too. What makes you think someone like Samuel Harrison would even notice you exist? Isabella gripped the shovel handle until her knuckles went white. Every word Pete spoke was true, but hearing it laid out so starkly felt like having salt rubbed into an open wound. "Leave her alone, Pete." The voice that cut through Pete's taunting was Samuel's, quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. Isabella looked up to see him approaching from the direction of the equipment shed. His expression calm, but his eyes hard as flint. Pete straightened up, clearly not having expected an audience. "Just having a friendly conversation with our resident ... He seemed to search for a word that would be cruel enough. "With Isabella," Samuel finished firmly. "And from where I stood, it didn't look very friendly." Pete's face reddened. "This ain't your business, Harrison. You just got here. You don't know how things work around here." Samuel moved closer, and Isabella noticed that he was several inches taller than Pete and considerably broader through the shoulders. "I know how decent people behave," he said quietly, "and I know bullying when I see it." For a moment, Isabella thought Pete might actually challenge Samuel physically. The younger man's hands clenched into fists, and his breathing grew rapid and shallow. But whatever he saw in Samuel's expression apparently convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. "Fine," Pete muttered, "but don't say I didn't warn you about what she is." He stalked away, leaving Isabella alone with Samuel in the suddenly quiet barnyard. She found herself unable to meet his eyes, humiliated by what he had witnessed and by Pete's crude assessment of her situation. "Don't listen to him," Samuel said gently. "Men like that say cruel things because it makes them feel bigger than they are." Isabella finally looked up at him, surprised by the compassion she saw in his face. "But he's not wrong, is he?" "About what I am." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. "What you are," he said finally, "is a young woman in a difficult situation who deserves to be treated with basic human decency. Everything else is just noise." The words were so unexpected, so different from anything she had heard in months, that Isabella felt tears threatening again. She turned away quickly, not wanting him to see her weakness. "Thank you," she whispered. For standing up to him. No thanks necessary." Samuel's voice was warm with something that might have been genuine affection. "And Isabella, if Pete or anyone else bothers you again, I want you to tell me, understood?" Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As Samuel walked away to continue his work, she found herself staring after him with a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because for the first time in months, someone had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. Terror because she was beginning to care what this stranger thought of her. And caring about someone was a luxury she couldn't afford in a place like this. That evening, as she settled into her makeshift bed in the barn, Isabella found herself thinking about Samuel's words. The idea that she deserved basic human decency felt foreign after weeks of being treated like an animal. But maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe there was still some part of her worth saving, some core of dignity that Jeremiah and his cronies hadn't managed to destroy. As she drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the pigs settling in for the night, Isabella allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to be treated as a human being again. It was a dangerous thought, she knew, but for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep with something that felt almost like hope warming her heart. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, but perhaps, occasionally, witness to small acts of kindness that had the power to change everything. October melted into November, with the kind of cold that crept into bones and stayed there. The mornings brought frost that turned the pig pens into treacherous patches of slick mud, and Isabella's condition made navigating the icy terrain increasingly dangerous. At 8 months pregnant, every movement required careful calculation. Every step a potential hazard that could send her tumbling into the frozen muck. Samuel had been at the farm for 3 weeks. and his presence had begun to shift the delicate balance of power in ways both subtle and profound. Unlike the other workers who either ignored Isabella entirely or treated her with open contempt, Samuel made a point of acknowledging her existence with small gestures of courtesy that felt revolutionary in their simple humanity. He had taken to leaving warm coffee outside her sleeping area on particularly cold mornings, never saying anything about it, but always ensuring the cup was there when she emerged to begin her daily tasks. When she struggled with heavy feed buckets, he would quietly appear to take the burden from her hands, offering only a brief nod before continuing about his own work. These acts of kindness were performed without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, which somehow made them more precious than any grand gesture could have been. The other farmhands had begun to notice Samuel's protective attitude toward Isabella, and their reactions varied dramatically. Frank Morrison seemed quietly approving, occasionally sharing meaningful glances with Samuel when Jeremiah wasn't looking. David Chun remained diplomatically neutral, though Isabella sometimes caught him watching Samuel's interventions with what might have been admiration. Pete, however, had grown increasingly hostile, his resentment simmering just beneath the surface of every interaction. It was Jeremiah's reaction that concerned Isabella most. She had seen him watching Samuel with the calculating gaze of a predator studying potential prey. There was something in his expression that suggested he was planning some kind of test, some way to either break Samuel's spirit or drive him away from the farm entirely. The test came on a gray Tuesday morning when the wind cut through the valley like a rusty blade. Isabella had been attempting to repair a section of fence that had been damaged during the night. One of the older boars had apparently gotten agitated and charged the wooden rails until they splintered. The work required her to kneel in the frozen mud while trying to hold the boards in place with one hand and hammer nails with the other, a task made nearly impossible by her unwieldy belly. She had been struggling with a particularly stubborn board when she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she expected to see Samuel coming to offer assistance, as he had done so many times before. Instead, she found herself facing Jeremiah, flanked by Crawford and Hayes. The two men had been visiting the farm more frequently lately, and their presence never boded well for anyone, least of all Isabella. "Having trouble with that fence?" Jeremiah asked, his voice carrying that familiar tone of false concern that always preceded something unpleasant. Isabella straightened slowly, her hand instinctively moving to support her lower back. "I'll get it fixed, Mr. Blackwood. Just need a little more time." "Time," Jeremiah repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, time is something we all have to manage carefully, isn't it? And lately, I've been thinking that maybe you've been having too much help with your work, making things too easy for you." Isabella's stomach clenched with dread. She had known this moment would come eventually. Jeremiah had been tolerating Samuel's kindness toward her for weeks, but his patience was clearly at an end. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Crawford laughed, the sound harsh in the cold air. "Oh, I think you know exactly what he means. You've got that new fellow wrapped around your little finger, haven't you? Got him thinking you're some kind of princess instead of what you really are." Hayes stepped closer, his breath visible in white puffs as he spoke. "Maybe it's time somebody reminded both of you where you belong in the pecking order around here." Before Isabella could respond, she heard Samuel's voice calling from across the yard. "Isabella, I thought you might need some help with that fence." Jeremiah's smile was cold as winter steel. Perfect timing. "I was just thinking we needed to have a conversation with Mr. Harrison about his priorities." Samuel approached with his usual steady confidence, but Isabella could see the wariness in his eyes as he took in the scene. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the frigid air. "Gentlemen," he said politely, his voice giving nothing away. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Beautiful is one word for it," Jeremiah replied. "Samuel, I've been observing your work these past few weeks, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You're skilled, reliable, and you follow orders without complaint. Exactly the kind of worker I value." Samuel nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing, clearly sensing that praise from Jeremiah was likely to come with strings attached. "However," Jeremiah continued, his tone sharpening, "I've also noticed that you seem to have developed some misguided sympathies, a tendency to waste time on tasks that aren't your responsibility." "I'm not sure I follow," Samuel said evenly. Though Isabella could see the tension building in his shoulders, Crawford stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the handle of a leather whip he wore at his belt. "He means you've been playing nursemaid to this little whore when you should be focusing on real work." The word hit Isabella like a physical blow, but it was Samuel's reaction that surprised her. His entire body went rigid, and when he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge that she had never heard before. "I'd choose my words more carefully if I were you," he said quietly. Hayes laughed, apparently unimpressed by the implied threat. "Or what? You'll defend her honor?" "She's got no honor to defend, boy. Look at her carrying some man's bastard, sleeping with pigs, too worthless even for decent charity." Samuel took a step forward, and Isabella saw something flash in his storm-gray eyes that made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might actually strike Hayes. Consequences be damned. But Jeremiah raised a hand, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Now, let's not get excited. I have a much better idea for settling this disagreement." He gestured toward one of the larger pig pens, where a massive boar named Brutus was housed. Brutus was known for his aggressive temperament and had injured 2 workers in the past year with his charges and bites. "Samuel," Jeremiah said conversationally, "I want you to go into Brutus's pen and clean it thoroughly while he's still in there." The request was clearly intended to be impossible. Brutus weighed over 400 pounds and had a well-documented hatred of humans. Entering his pen while he was present would be tantamount to suicide. Samuel looked at the pen, then back at Jeremiah. "And if I refuse?" "If you refuse," Jeremiah said with mock sadness, "then I'll have to assume you're not the kind of worker I need here. You'll be off my property within the hour. Of course, that would leave poor Isabella here without her ... protector." The threat was clear. Samuel's refusal wouldn't just cost him his job, would leave Isabella completely vulnerable to whatever Jeremiah had planned for her. Isabella wanted to tell Samuel to refuse, to save himself and not worry about what happened to her. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by the terrible knowledge that his protection had become the only thing standing between her and complete degradation. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying Brutus through the fence rails. The massive boar was snorting and pawing at the ground, already agitated by the presence of so many humans near his territory. "All right," Samuel said finally. "I'll do it." Isabella felt her heart stop. "Samuel, no. You don't understand. That animal is dangerous. He's hurt people before." Samuel turned to look at her, and the gentle smile he gave her was heartbreaking in its tenderness. "It'll be fine, Isabella. Trust me." But as he moved toward the pen gate, Isabella saw Crawford and Hayes exchanging satisfied glances. They expected Samuel to be mauled, possibly killed, and they were looking forward to the spectacle. Samuel paused at the gate, his hand on the latch. "Just so we're clear," he said to Jeremiah, "when I finish this task, you'll leave Isabella alone. No more games, no more tests. She does her work, and you treat her with basic human decency." Jeremiah's laugh was cold as the November wind. "We'll see. First, let's see if you survive the next few minutes." Samuel opened the gate and stepped into the pen. Brutus immediately charged, his massive bulk moving with surprising speed across the muddy ground. Isabella screamed, certain she was about to witness Samuel's death. But something extraordinary happened. Just as Brutus reached him, Samuel did something that stopped the boar in his tracks. He didn't run or raise his hands defensively. Instead, he dropped to one knee and began speaking in a low, steady voice that Isabella couldn't quite make out. Brutus skidded to a halt just inches from Samuel, snorting and tossing his head in confusion. The boar seemed genuinely puzzled by this human who wasn't showing fear or aggression. Samuel continued talking, his voice a soothing murmur that seemed to flow through the air like music. Slowly, incredibly, Brutus began to calm down. His ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, gradually relaxed. His breathing slowed from angry snorts to something approaching normal. Isabella watched in amazement as Samuel slowly extended his hand toward the massive animal. Brutus sniffed cautiously, then allowed Samuel to touch his snout with gentle fingers. "I'll be damned," Frank Morrison whispered from somewhere behind them. "I've never seen anything like that." Samuel began to move around the pen, cleaning and spreading fresh straw while Brutus watched with what could only be described as curiosity. The boar followed him at a safe distance, occasionally sniffing at Samuel's work, but making no aggressive moves. The entire process took perhaps 20 minutes, but to Isabella, it felt like hours. When Samuel finally emerged from the pen, closing the gate behind him with Brutus watching peacefully from the other side, the silence in the barnyard was deafening. Jeremiah single quotes' face was a mask of frustrated rage. His carefully planned humiliation had backfired spectacularly, and everyone present had witnessed Samuel's extraordinary skill with animals. "Interesting technique," Jeremiah said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Where did you learn to handle livestock like that?" Samuel brushed mud from his hands, his expression giving nothing away. "My father raised cattle. He taught me that every animal has its own language. You just have to take the time to learn it." It was the first personal information Samuel had shared about his past, and Isabella found herself hungry for more details about this mysterious man who had risked his life to protect her. Crawford and Hayes were clearly disappointed by the outcome. They had been expecting blood and violence, and Samuel's peaceful resolution of the situation had robbed them of their entertainment. "Lucky," Hayes muttered. "Pure dumb luck." Samuel turned to look at him, and there was steel in his voice when he spoke. "Luck had nothing to do with it. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have real work to do." As the group dispersed, Isabella found herself alone with Samuel for the first time since the confrontation began. She wanted to thank him, to somehow express her gratitude for what he had done, but the words felt inadequate. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you risk your life for me?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those storm gray eyes. "Because everyone deserves to have someone stand up for them," he said simply. "And because ... He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while others suffer." There was pain in his voice, old pain that spoke of losses and regrets that went far deeper than anything happening on this farm. Isabella wanted to ask about it, to understand what had brought this gentle, strong man to such a desperate place, but she sensed that such questions would have to wait. "Thank you," she said instead, the words carrying all the emotion she couldn't otherwise express. Samuel reached out and gently touched her shoulder, the contact sending warmth through her entire body. "You don't need to thank me, Isabella. Just be careful. Jeremiah isn't going to forget what happened here today, and men like him don't like being shown up in front of their friends." Isabella nodded, understanding the warning implicit in his words, but for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope, dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in the world after all. As Samuel walked away to continue his work, Isabella placed her hand on her belly and whispered to the child growing inside her, "Did you see that, little one? There are still good people in the world. People who fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous." The baby responded with a gentle kick, as if acknowledging her words. And for the first time since arriving at the Blackwood farm, Isabella allowed herself to believe that her child might have a chance at growing up in a world where kindness still existed. But even as hope bloomed in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jeremiah's humiliation would come with a price. Men like him didn't forgive easily, and they never forgot. The real test of Samuel's protection and her own survival was yet to come. The week following Samuel's confrontation with Brutus brought an uneasy calm to the Blackwood farm, the kind of stillness that preceded violent storms. Jeremiah had retreated into a cold fury that manifested in increasingly petty cruelties, extra work assignments for Samuel, deliberate scheduling conflicts that kept him away from the areas where Isabella worked, and a series of inspections that always found fault with her efforts no matter how thorough they were. But beneath the surface tension, something else was growing. Isabella had begun to notice the way Samuel's eyes sought her out across the barnyard, the way his entire posture changed when he caught sight of her struggling with a task beyond her physical capabilities. There was a protective intensity in his attention that went beyond simple kindness, something deeper and more personal that both thrilled and terrified her. For his part, Samuel had started taking unprecedented risks to spend time with Isabella. He would find excuses to work near the pig pens where she was assigned, arriving early to help with the heavier tasks before the other workers could notice. During the brief lunch periods when she ate her solitary meal, he would appear with additional food wrapped in clean cloth bread, still warm from the kitchen, pieces of fruit that somehow found their way from Jeremiah's private stores once, even a small jar of honey that must have cost him a day's wages. "You need to eat more," he had said one afternoon, setting down a wrapped bundle beside her makeshift table in the barn. "The baby needs nutrition, and you're getting thinner despite ... He gestured gently toward her expanding belly. Isabella had unwrapped the cloth to find thick slices of ham and cheese, luxury items that farm workers rarely saw. "Samuel, where did you get this? If Jeremiah finds out you're taking food from the kitchen, let me worry about Jeremiah," Samuel had replied, settling down beside her on a bale of hay. "You just focus on taking care of yourself and that child." It was during these stolen moments that Isabella began to learn fragments of Samuel's story. He spoke carefully, revealing details like precious coins counted out, one at a time. But gradually she pieced together a picture of a man haunted by loss and driven by the need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He had been married once, she learned, to a woman named Catherine who had died in childbirth along with their son. The tragedy had occurred 3 years earlier in a town called Millbrook, where Samuel had worked as a veterinarian, treating both farm animals and the occasional family pet. The loss had shattered something fundamental in him, driving him to abandon his practice and take to the roads as a wandering laborer. "I couldn't save them," he had said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I had all the medical knowledge, all the training, and when it mattered most, I was helpless. Catherine was in labor for 18 hours, and there was nothing I could do but watch her suffer." Isabella had reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. "It wasn't your fault. Women die in childbirth. It's one of the risks we all face." Samuel had turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers with gentle pressure. "Knowing that doesn't make it easier. For a long time, I thought maybe I was being punished for something. Maybe I hadn't been grateful enough for what I had, or maybe I'd made some mistake that cost them their lives. And now?" Isabella had asked softly. "Now I think maybe I was being prepared for something else. Maybe all that pain was meant to teach me something I needed to know." He had looked at her then with eyes that held depths of feeling she was afraid to acknowledge. "Maybe it was preparing me to recognize something precious when I found it again." The conversation had left Isabella shaken, not because she didn't understand what Samuel was saying, but because she understood it all too well. The growing connection Between them was becoming impossible to ignore, but it was also fraught with dangers that went far beyond Jeremir's wrath. Isabella was a pregnant woman with no resources and a past that would never completely disappear. Samuel was a skilled man with his whole life ahead of him, someone who could find respectable work anywhere he chose to settle. The gulf between their circumstances seemed unbridgeable, and yet she found herself hoping against hope that somehow they might find a way to cross it together. The crisis that would test their growing bond came on a snow-covered morning in late November. Isabella had woken before dawn with unusual cramping in her lower back, discomfort that she initially attributed to the increasing awkwardness of sleeping on a thin mattress. But as the morning progressed and she began her daily tasks, the pain intensified into something that made her stop work entirely and lean against fence posts while she caught her breath. She was attempting to fill water troughs when the cramping became so severe that she dropped the bucket entirely, spilling the precious water across the frozen ground. The sound of metal striking ice carried across the barnyard, and within moments she heard footsteps approaching rapidly. "Isabella," Samuel's voice cut through the morning air. "What's wrong?" She tried to straighten up, to pretend that everything was normal, but another wave of pain doubled her over. Samuel was beside her instantly, his strong arm supporting her weight as she struggled to remain upright. "The baby," she gasped, her hand pressed against her belly. "Something's wrong." "It's too early. I'm only 8 months along." Samuel's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "We need to get you inside, somewhere warm. Can you walk?" Before Isabella could answer, Jeremir's voice boomed across the yard. "What's going on here? Why isn't that water trough filled?" Samuel helped Isabella straighten up, his arm remaining around her waist for support. "She's having complications with the pregnancy. She needs medical attention." Jeremir approached with his characteristic swagger, but Isabella could see calculation in his eyes as he took in the scene. "Complications? What kind of complications?" "The kind that require a doctor," Samuel said firmly. "The nearest town is 15 miles away. If we take the wagon and leave now—" "We're not taking anything anywhere," Jeremir interrupted. "That girl knew the risks when she got herself into this situation. If she can't handle the work, maybe she doesn't deserve the job." Isabella felt another wave of cramping, this one strong enough to make her cry out despite her efforts to remain silent. Samuel's grip on her tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge. "She's not going anywhere in this condition, except to get help. You can fire me if you want, but I'm taking her to town." Jeremir's eyes narrowed. "You're not taking anything that belongs to me, and that includes the wagon, the horses, and the girl." "She doesn't belong to you," Samuel said quietly. "She's not property, isn't she?" Jeremir's laugh was cold as the winter wind. "She's working off her debt to me, room, board, the generosity I showed in giving her a job when no one else would. She doesn't leave until that debt is paid in full." Isabella wanted to argue, to point out that she had been working for months without wages and that any reasonable debt would have been paid off long ago. But another contraction hit her, this one strong enough to buckle her knees. Only Samuel's steady support kept her from falling to the frozen ground. "Look at her," Samuel said urgently. "She could lose the baby or worse. Whatever debt you think she owes you, it's not worth a woman's life." Jeremir studied Isabella's pale, pain-racked face with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. "I've seen women give birth in worse conditions than this. If she's strong enough to survive, she will. If not, he shrugged. Nature has a way of sorting these things out." The callousness of his response ignited something fierce in Samuel's expression. For a moment, Isabella thought he might actually strike Jeremir. Consequences be damned. But instead, he lifted Isabella into his arms with gentle strength, cradling her against his chest. "Then I'm taking her somewhere she can get help with or without your permission." "Put her down," Jeremiah commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "You work for me, Harrison, and you'll follow my orders." Samuel began walking toward the main house, his steps steady despite Isabella's weight in his arms. "I quit. If you take one more step, I'll have you arrested for theft," Jeremiah called after him. "That's my property you're carrying." Samuel stopped, but only to look back over his shoulder. "Then you'll have to explain to the sheriff why you refused medical care to a pregnant woman. I'm curious to see how that conversation goes." It was a masterful bit of psychological warfare. Jeremiah might be able to justify many cruelties to himself and others, but denying emergency medical care to a woman in labor would be difficult to explain away, even in a place where Isabella's social status offered her little protection. Jeremiah's face flushed with rage, but he stepped aside as Samuel continued toward the house. "This isn't over, Harrison. When this is all done, we're going to settle accounts." Samuel didn't respond to the threat. His entire focus was on Isabella, who had begun to shiver despite the warmth of his body against hers. He carried her into the main house the first time she had been inside since her arrival at the farm, and settled her carefully onto the sofa in Jeremiah's front parlor. "I need to get the wagon ready," he said, brushing a strand of hair away from her sweat-dampened forehead. "Can you hang on for a few more minutes?" Isabella nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The contractions were coming more frequently now, and each one brought the terrifying possibility that her child might be born too early to survive. Samuel disappeared for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When he returned, he was accompanied by Frank Morrison, who looked genuinely concerned about Isabella's condition. "Frank's going to help me get you to the wagon," Samuel explained. "It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's the fastest way to get you to a doctor." The journey to town was a nightmare of jolting wagon wheels and increasingly frequent contractions. Samuel had wrapped Isabella in every blanket he could find, but the November cold seemed to seep through everything, adding the misery of hypothermia to her other concerns. He drove the horses harder than was probably safe, the urgency of the situation overriding his usual careful treatment of animals. Frank Morrison had insisted on coming along, partly to help with Isabella, but mostly, she suspected, to provide moral support for Samuel. The older man seemed to understand that this journey represented more than just a medical emergency. It was Samuel's declaration that he would not stand by and watch injustice happen, regardless of the personal cost. "There's the town," Frank called out as they crested a hill overlooking a cluster of buildings nestled in the valley below. "Dr. Patterson's office is right on Main Street." Isabella had never been so grateful to see civilization. The pain had become constant now, and she was beginning to fear that the baby might be born in the back of a wagon on a frozen road miles. From any help. Dr. Patterson turned out to be a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and steady hands that spoke of decades of experience. He took one look at Isabella's condition and immediately began issuing orders that sent his assistants scurrying for supplies. "How far along is she?" he asked Samuel while helping Isabella onto an examination table. 8 months, as near as we can figure," Samuel replied. "The contractions started this morning and have been getting stronger." Dr. Patterson nodded, his hands already beginning a gentle but thorough examination. "Sometimes babies decide they're ready before we think they should be. The question is whether we can slow things down enough to give this little one a better chance." What followed were several hours of medical intervention that Isabella would later remember only in fragments. Dr. Patterson administered medications that eased the contractions and provided pain relief that allowed her to rest between episodes. Samuel remained by her side throughout the entire ordeal, holding her hand and speaking in the same soothing voice he had used to calm Brutus. "Talk to me," she had whispered during one particularly difficult moment. "Tell me something beautiful." Samuel had been quiet for a moment, searching for words that could provide comfort in such circumstances. "When I was a boy," he had said. "Finally, my mother used to take me to a meadow behind our house in the spring. The whole field would be covered with wildflowers, blues and yellows and purples that seemed to go on forever. She told me that each flower was proof that beautiful things could grow even in the hardest ground if they had enough love and patience. Do you think that's true?" Isabella had asked. Samuel had squeezed her hand gently. "I'm beginning to." By evening, Dr. Patterson was cautiously optimistic that the crisis had passed. The contractions had slowed significantly, and Isabella's vital signs had stabilized. The baby was still active, responding well to the interventions. "She needs complete bed rest for the next month," the doctor told Samuel as they stood outside the examination room. "And she shouldn't be doing any physical labor. A pregnancy this far along requires careful monitoring, especially after an episode like this." Samuel nodded, but Isabella could see the worry in his expression. "What about after the baby comes? What kind of care will she need then?" "A new mother needs support, proper nutrition, and time to recover," Dr. Patterson said. "She'll be vulnerable for several weeks, and the baby will need constant attention. It's not the kind of situation where she can return to manual labor immediately." The implications were clear. Even if Isabella recovered from this crisis, her ability to work at the farm was essentially finished. She would need months of care and support, resources that neither she nor Samuel possessed. As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "There are options for women in her situation. The church runs a home for unwed mothers in Denver. They provide care during the final weeks of pregnancy and help arrange adoptions for the children." Isabella, who had been listening from the examination table, spoke up with surprising strength. "No, I'm not giving up my baby." Dr. Patterson looked between her and Samuel with the expression of a man who had seen too many difficult situations. "Miss, I understand your feelings, but you need to consider what's practical. Raising a child alone, without resources or family support, she won't be alone," Samuel said quietly. The words hung in the air like a promise and a challenge. "Doctor." Patterson raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by this development. "Samuel," Isabella said softly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, moving to sit beside her on the examination table. "I've spent 3 years running from responsibility, telling myself that I was protecting people by staying away from them, but maybe it's time I stopped running." He took her hand in both of his storm gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Isabella, I know we haven't known each other very long. I know your situation is complicated, and I know I can't offer you the kind of life you probably dreamed of when you were a girl. But I can offer you protection and respect, and a chance for your child to grow up safe." Isabella felt tears threatening, emotions too complex to untangle. "You're talking about marriage." "I'm talking about partnership," Samuel said carefully. "Two people who care about each other, facing whatever comes together instead of alone. If you'll have me." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat again. "Perhaps this conversation should wait until the immediate medical crisis has passed." But Isabella was already shaking her head. "No, I need to know that this is real, that you're not just saying these things because you feel sorry for me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Isabella, I haven't felt sorry for you since the day I met you. What I've felt is admiration for your strength, anger at how you've been treated, and something else that I wasn't sure I'd ever feel again." "What?" she whispered. "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that maybe I could be part of something good again. Hope that maybe I could help create the kind of life that Catherine and I never got to have." Isabella closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Marriage to Samuel would solve her immediate problems. It would give her and her child protection, stability, and a chance at respectability. But it would also mean accepting a relationship based on practical necessity rather than the kind of deep love she had always dreamed of finding. And yet, as she looked at this man who had risked everything to bring her to safety, who had stood up to Jeremiah's cruelty and offered her tenderness when she had forgotten such things existed, she realized that maybe practical necessity could grow into something deeper. Maybe love didn't always arrive as a lightning bolt. Maybe sometimes it grew slowly, nurtured by kindness and respect and shared commitment to building something worthwhile together. "Yes," she said finally, the word barely audible. Samuel's face transformed with relief and something that looked very much like joy. "Yes? Yeah, I'll marry you. If you're sure this is what you want." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Samuel said, leaning forward to kiss her forehead with gentle reverence. Dr. Patterson, who had been witnessing this exchange with growing amazement, shook his head in wonder. "Well, that's settled. Then. But first, we need to make sure both mother and baby are healthy enough for any kind of ceremony. Miss Rodriguez, you're staying here tonight for observation. And Mr. Harrison, you'll need to find the justice of the peace if you're serious about this marriage business." As evening settled over the small town, Isabella found herself in a clean bed with warm blankets and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. Through the window, she could see Samuel talking earnestly with Frank Morrison, no doubt making plans for their return to the farm to collect their belongings and face whatever consequences awaited them there. The baby moved restlessly in her belly, as if sensing the dramatic changes taking place in their lives. Isabella placed her hand over the movement and whispered a promise to the child she carried. "Everything's going to be different now, little one. We're going to have a family and a real home and someone who will love us both. I know it's not the way I planned things, but maybe it's better than anything I could have planned." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the town in a blanket of white that seemed to promise new beginnings and fresh starts. For the first time since leaving her family home months ago, Isabella allowed herself to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The morning after their impromptu engagement brought a crisp December air that seemed to crystallize the monumental changes in Isabella's life. She woke in the doctor's small guest room to find pale sunlight streaming through lace curtains, a luxury she had almost forgotten existed after months of waking to the dim interior of a pig barn. Her body felt remarkably better. The cramping had subsided to occasional twinges, and the baby's movements had returned to their normal, reassuring rhythm. Dr. Patterson's examination confirmed what she dared to hope. The crisis had passed completely. Both mother and child were stable, though he maintained his insistence on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. "You've been fortunate," he said, helping her sit up for the examination. "Another few hours without intervention, and we might have been dealing with a very different outcome. The stress on your body has been considerable, more than any woman should have to endure, especially while carrying a child." Through the window, Isabella could see Samuel pacing in the small garden behind the doctor's house, his breath creating white puffs in the cold air. He had spent the night in the town's single boarding house but had arrived before dawn to check on her condition. The sight of him, solid and dependable despite the uncertainty of their situation, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the quilts covering her. "Dr. Patterson," she said carefully, "what Samuel suggested yesterday about marriage do? You think we're being foolish? Moving too quickly because of the circumstances?" The elderly physician paused in his note-taking, considering her question with the thoughtfulness that had made him trusted by 3 generations of families in the surrounding area. "Miss Rodriguez, in my experience, crisis has a way of revealing people's true character. Some individuals crumble under pressure, while others rise to meet challenges with grace and courage. What I witnessed yesterday was a man willing to sacrifice his own security to ensure your safety, and a woman strong enough to fight for her child's life, even when everyone else had given up on her." He set down his pen and looked at her directly, The question isn't whether you're moving too quickly. The question is whether you trust each other enough to build something lasting from what admittedly began as a practical arrangement. Love has grown from stranger foundations than mutual respect and shared adversity. Isabella nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, while still grappling with the magnitude of the decision she had made. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being a desperate, unmarried, pregnant woman with no prospects to an engaged woman with a future that included marriage, security, and the possibility of genuine happiness. But first, they had to deal with the immediate practicalities. Samuel had spent much of the previous evening in deep conversation with Frank Morrison, planning their return to the Blackwood farm to collect their belongings and formally terminate their employment. It would not be a pleasant confrontation, Jeremiah's parting words had made it clear that he considered Samuel's departure a personal betrayal that would not go unpunished. The knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Samuel entered quietly, carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper and wearing an expression that managed to combine determination with barely concealed anxiety. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Better, much better actually. Dr. Patterson says the baby and I are both doing well." She gestured toward the bundle in his hands. "What's that?" Samuel's cheeks reddened slightly as he unwrapped the package to reveal a simple blue dress, clearly new and carefully chosen. "I thought. That is, when we go to see the justice of the peace, you might want something clean to wear. Something that wasn't." He gestured helplessly, unable to find diplomatic words for her work-stained farm clothes. The thoughtfulness of the gesture nearly brought tears to Isabella's eyes. It had been months since anyone had considered her comfort or dignity, and this small act of consideration felt more precious than expensive jewelry. "It's beautiful," she said softly, running her fingers over the soft cotton fabric. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Samuel interrupted gently. "Isabella, I want you to understand something. What we're doing, this marriage, it's not charity, and it's not just about protecting you and the baby. I meant what I said yesterday about hope. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to believe in the future again." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. When he unfolded it, Isabella gasped. It was a ring, not an expensive one, but clearly chosen with care. The band was simple gold, set with a small pearl that caught the morning light like captured moonbeams. "It belonged to my grandmother," Samuel explained, his voice suddenly shy. "My mother gave it to me before I left home, said I should save it for someone special. I've been carrying it around for 3 years, never imagining I'd find anyone who ... He trailed off, then started again. "Isabella, would you do me the honor of accepting this ring, and with it, my promise to be the kind of husband you and your child deserve?" Isabella stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what it represented. This wasn't just a practical arrangement anymore. Samuel was offering her his family's history, his grandmother's blessing, and his own heart laid bare. "Are you proposing to me properly this time?" she asked, trying to lighten the emotional weight of the moment. Samuel's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the crisis began. "I suppose I am. Isabella Rodriguez, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" "Yes," she whispered, extending her hand so he could slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her specifically. "Yes, Samuel Harrison, I will marry you." The kiss that followed was gentle, tender, full of promise and the sweet hesitation of new love. When they broke apart, Isabella felt as if the world had shifted on its axis, realigning itself around this new reality they were creating together. Dr. Patterson appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat diplomatically. "I hate to interrupt, but Justice Miller is here to see you both. Apparently, word has gotten around town about your situation. And he's offered to perform the ceremony this afternoon if you're still determined to proceed. Isabella looked at Samuel in surprise. This afternoon? Don't we need witnesses or documents? Or, I've taken care of the legal requirements, Samuel said. Frank agreed to stand as witness, and Dr. Patterson has provided medical documentation of your condition. Justice Miller says he's performed marriages under more unusual circumstances. The speed with which everything was moving felt surreal. But Isabella realized that delay would only create more opportunities for complications. Jeremiah wouldn't simply accept their departure without attempting some form of retaliation, and the sooner they were legally married, the better protected she would be. Then let's do it, she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. Let's get married today. The ceremony that afternoon was unlike anything Isabella had ever imagined for her wedding day. Instead of a white dress and flowers, she wore Samuel's carefully chosen blue cotton dress and carried a small bouquet of evergreen sprigs that Frank had gathered from the woods behind town. Instead of a church filled with family and friends, they stood in Justice Miller's small parlor with only Dr. Patterson, Frank Morrison, and the justice's wife as witnesses. But as Samuel took her hands and spoke his vows in that steady, gentle voice that had become her anchor in the storm of recent events, Isabella felt that no cathedral ceremony could have been more sacred. He promised to love and protect her and her child, to build a home where they could all find peace, and to never let her face the world's cruelties alone again. When it came time for her vows, Isabella found herself speaking from the heart rather than reciting the traditional words Justice Miller had offered. Samuel, you came into my life when I had lost everything, my family, my hope, my belief that good people still existed. You've shown me that love doesn't always come the way we expect it, but that doesn't make it less real or less precious. I promise to be your partner in building the life we both deserve, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, and to love you with a heart that grows stronger every day. The ring ceremony was particularly moving. Samuel had found a simple gold band for himself, and as Isabella slipped it onto his finger, she realized she was not just gaining a husband, but becoming part of a family legacy that stretched back through generations of strong, loving people. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, Justice Miller intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was deeper this time, more confident, sealing not just their legal union but their emotional commitment to the uncertain future they would face together. When they broke apart, Isabella saw tears in Samuel's eyes that matched her own. Frank Morrison stepped forward with a gruff smile, shaking Samuel's hand with genuine warmth. Congratulations, both of you. You've got something special here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Dr. Patterson presented them with a marriage certificate written in his careful handwriting, along with a letter documenting Isabella's medical condition and the care she would need in the coming weeks. This should satisfy any legal questions. About your union, he said. And Mrs. Harrison, he added, testing out her new name with a smile. Remember what I said about rest. Your husband is going to have to take very good care of you. As the small group shared cake and coffee in Justice Miller's parlor, Isabella felt a profound sense of transformation. She was no longer Isabella Rodriguez, the disgraced daughter who had brought shame to her family. She was Isabella Harrison, a married woman with a husband who had chosen her despite knowing all her circumstances. The child she carried would be born legitimate, with a father who had claimed them both willingly and openly. But the celebration was necessarily brief. They still had to return to the Blackwood farm to collect their belongings and face whatever confrontation Jeremiah had prepared for them. Samuel had already purchased train tickets for the following morning. They would travel to Denver, where his veterinary skills could secure them a fresh start far from the shadows of their past. The ride back to the farm took place in gathering twilight, the wagon wheels crunching through snow that had fallen steadily throughout the day. Isabella sat close to Samuel on the driver's bench, drawing warmth from his body and strength from his presence. Frank Morrison rode in the back, having insisted on accompanying them despite Samuel's concerns about involving him in what might become an ugly confrontation. "Jeremier's not going to let this go easily," Frank warned as they approached the familiar outline of the farm buildings. "He sees everything that happens here as a reflection of his authority. Having workers simply walk away, especially after what happened yesterday, it challenges his whole sense of control." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Then we'll deal with whatever he throws at us. But we're not staying, and we're not apologizing for doing what was right." The farmyard was unusually quiet when they arrived, with no sign of the other workers who should have been finishing the evening chores. The main house was lit up like a beacon, warm yellow lights spilling from every window in a display that seemed designed to demonstrate Jeremier's prosperity and power. As they climbed down from the wagon, the front door of the house opened and Jeremier emerged, flanked by Crawford and Hayes. All three men looked like they had been drinking, and their expressions promised trouble. "Well, well," Jeremier called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The happy couple returns. How was the wedding, Harrison? Did you enjoy playing hero for your little whore?" Samuel stepped protectively in front of Isabella, his hand moving instinctively to her elbow to steady her. "We've come to collect our belongings, Blackwood. Then we'll be on our way." Jeremier laughed, the sound harsh and brittle in the cold air. "On your way? Just like that? You think you can walk onto my property, seduce one of my workers, steal my wagon and horses, and then just leave without consequences?" "I didn't steal anything," Samuel replied evenly. "I borrowed your wagon to save a woman's life, and I brought it back. As for seducing anyone, Isabella and I are married now. Whatever relationship we have is none of your business." Crawford stepped forward, swaying slightly from whatever he had been drinking. "Married? To a pregnant whore? What kind of man are you, Harrison?" The insult hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Isabella felt Samuel's entire body tense beside her, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike Crawford, despite the odds against him. Instead, Samuel spoke with deadly quiet. "The kind of man who recognizes something precious when he finds it. The kind who doesn't stand by while bullies torment people who can't defend themselves." Hayes joined the confrontation, his massive fists clenched at his sides. "Big words from someone who's about to learn what happens to people who cross us." Frank Morrison moved to stand beside Samuel, his weathered face grim but determined. "That's enough. Let them get their things and go. There's been enough trouble here. Stay out of this, Frank," Jeremier warned. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when 3 drunk men threaten a pregnant woman and her husband," Frank replied firmly. "It concerns me when decent people are treated like animals." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Isabella stepped forward, placing herself between the opposing groups despite Samuel's protective gesture. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength, "I want to thank you." The unexpected words clearly caught Jeremier off guard. "Thank me?" "Yes," Isabella continued, her hand resting on her belly where her child stirred restlessly. "If you hadn't treated me so cruelly, if you hadn't shown me exactly what kind of man you are, I might never have recognized what kind of man Samuel is. Your cruelty helped me appreciate his kindness. Your hatred helped me recognize his love." She paused, looking directly at each of the 3 men who had made her life miserable. "So thank you for teaching me the difference between men who take what they want by force and men who give what they have freely. Thank you for showing me that I deserved better than anything you could ever offer." The speech left Jeremier speechless, his face cycling through expressions of rage, confusion, and something that might have been shame. Crawford and Hayes looked similarly deflated, as if Isabella's calm dignity had robbed them of the violent Confrontation they had been anticipating. Samuel took advantage of the silence to address the practical matters at hand. "We'll get our things from the barn and be gone within the hour. You'll never see us again." "The hell you will," Jeremiah finally sputtered, his rage overcoming his momentary confusion. "You owe me for room and board, for the inconvenience of training you." "For what?" Samuel interrupted. "For the privilege of working 16-hour days? For sleeping in a barn? For watching you humiliate and abuse a pregnant woman?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Here's a week's wages. That should more than cover anything we owe you." He tossed the pouch at Jeremiah's feet, the coins making a small chinking sound as they hit the frozen ground. It was a gesture of contempt disguised as payment, and everyone present understood its meaning. Jeremiah's face turned purple with rage. "You arrogant bastard. You think you can come onto my property, steal my workers, and then lecture me about how to run my business?" "I think," Samuel said quietly, "that we're done talking." He took Isabella's arm and began walking toward the barn where their few possessions waited. Frank Morrison fell into step beside them, clearly prepared to provide whatever protection he could offer. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. "You'll regret this, Harrison," he called after them. "Both of you. The world doesn't have room for people like you dreamers who think they can change how things work." Samuel paused at the barn door, looking back over his shoulder. "Maybe not. But we're going to try anyway." The process of collecting their belongings took less than 20 minutes. Isabella had arrived at the farm with only a small suitcase, and the months of labor had added nothing to her possessions except the clothes Samuel had bought her for the wedding. Samuel's belongings were similarly modest: a change of clothes, some basic tools, and a worn leather journal that he handled with particular care. As they loaded their few possessions into the wagon, Frank Morrison pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. Isabella couldn't hear the words, but she saw Frank press something into Samuel's hand. Money, probably, or perhaps a letter of recommendation that might help them find work in Denver. "Are you sure about this?" Frank asked quietly as they prepared to leave. "It's a big world out there, and starting over isn't easy, especially with a baby coming." Samuel looked at Isabella, who was settling herself carefully on the wagon seat, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Frank. Thank you for everything, for being kind to her when no one else would, for standing with us tonight." Frank nodded, his weathered face showing emotion he rarely allowed others to see. "You take care of that girl, Samuel. She's been through more than anyone should have to endure." "I will," Samuel promised. "And Frank, if you ever need anything, if Jeremiah makes things difficult for you because of what happened tonight, we'll be in Denver. Find us." As they drove away from the Blackwood farm for the final time, Isabella turned to look back at the buildings that had housed so much misery and fear. But also, she realized, they had housed the beginning of her relationship with Samuel. Without the trials they had endured together, they might never have discovered the strength of their connection. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, following her gaze. Isabella turned back to face the road ahead, where their future waited in all its uncertain promise. "None," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The wagon wheels crunched through snow as they made their way toward town and the boarding house where they would spend their wedding night. Behind them, the lights of the Blackwood farm faded into darkness, taking with them the last remnants of Isabella's old life. Ahead lay Denver, with its possibilities and challenges, its promise of anonymity and fresh starts. Most importantly, ahead lay the chance to build something good from the ashes of what had been destroyed: a family, a home, a love that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger for the testing. As the stars emerged overhead in the clear winter sky, "Isabella." Harrison placed her hand over her husband's where it rested on the wagon reins. The gesture was small, but it spoke of connection, of partnership. of two people choosing to face whatever storms might come with unified hearts and shared dreams. The child in her belly moved gently, as if responding to the peace that had finally settled over their small family. Soon, very soon, there would be 3 of them beginning this new chapter together. And for the first time since leaving her family home months ago, Isabella allowed herself to believe that their story might indeed have the happy ending she had almost stopped believing in. The train to Denver departed at dawn, its whistle piercing the crystalline air of the Montana morning like a declaration of independence. Isabella sat pressed against the window of their modest passenger car, watching the familiar landscape of her trials fade into memory as the locomotive gained speed. Beside her, Samuel held her hand with gentle firmness, his thumb tracing reassuring circles on her palm as they journeyed toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The past 24 hours had transformed her existence so completely that Isabella sometimes felt as though she were inhabiting someone else's life. Yesterday morning, she had been a desperate, unmarried woman sleeping in a pig barn. Now she was Mrs. Samuel Harrison, traveling in comfort toward a city where no one knew her history, where her child would be born into legitimacy and love. The train car was filled with other travelers pursuing their own dreams of reinvention, farmers seeking better land, young men chasing rumors of opportunity, families fleeing poverty or persecution. Isabella found herself studying their faces, wondering if any of them carried secrets as heavy as her own, if any had experienced transformations as dramatic as hers. Nervous? Samuel asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails. Isabella considered the question carefully. Excited, she said finally. Scared, but in a good way. Like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you're about to jump, but trusting that you'll learn to fly. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. I like that image. Catherine used to say something similar, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. It was the first time Samuel had mentioned his deceased wife without pain shadowing his features, and Isabella took it as a positive sign. Perhaps he was finally beginning to heal from that devastating loss, to believe that loving again didn't diminish what he had shared with Catherine. The journey to Denver took 8 hours, winding through mountain passes and valleys that showcased the raw beauty of the American West. Isabella had never traveled so far from home, had never seen landscape on such a grand scale. The mountains seemed to touch the sky itself, their snow-capped peaks glowing pink and gold in the changing light. During the long hours of travel, she and Samuel talked more openly than they ever had before. He shared stories of his childhood in Ohio, his veterinary training, his dreams of perhaps opening his own practice again someday. She told him about her sisters, about the embroidery her mother had taught her, about the books she had read secretly by candlelight when her family thought education was wasted on daughters. I want to learn to read better, she admitted as they shared lunch from a basket Dr. Patterson had provided. I can manage simple things, but I've always wanted to read real books. Stories, poetry, medical texts even. Samuel's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. I have dozens of veterinary books, and I've always loved literature. I'd be honored to help you study whatever interests you. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to Isabella it represented something profound. Samuel wasn't just offering her protection and respectability, he was offering her the chance to grow, to become more than circumstances had allowed her to be. As afternoon melted into evening, the train finally pulled into Denver's bustling Union Station. The city was larger than anything Isabella had ever experienced, with electric lights beginning to twinkle in windows and the sound of automobile engines mixing with horse hooves on cobblestone streets. The air itself felt different, thick with coal smoke and possibility, heavy with the dreams of thousands of people pursuing new lives. Samuel had telegraphed ahead to secure lodging at a respectable boarding house near the city center. The proprietor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, was a widow in her 50s who rented rooms to working families and asked few questions about her tenants' backgrounds. She greeted the Harrisons with professional courtesy, tinged with maternal concern, when she noticed Isabella's advanced pregnancy. "You'll want the room on the first floor," she said, leading them up a short flight of stairs. "Easier for a woman in your condition, and there's a window that catches the morning sun." "When is the baby due?" "Early February," Samuel replied, his arm supporting Isabella as they climbed. Mrs. Whitman nodded approvingly. "Dr. Jameson lives just 3 blocks away. Delivered half the babies in this neighborhood, including my own grandchildren. I'll give you his address tomorrow." The room she showed them was modest but clean, with a comfortable bed, a writing desk, and 2 windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street. After months of sleeping in a pig barn, it seemed luxurious beyond imagination. "It's perfect," Isabella said, settling carefully into the room's single armchair. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman." The older woman studied Isabella with sharp but kind eyes. "You look tired, dear. When did you last have a proper meal?" Isabella realized she couldn't remember. The past few days had been a blur of medical emergencies, marriage ceremonies, and travel arrangements. Food had been an afterthought in the midst of such dramatic changes. "I'll have Molly bring up some soup and bread," Mrs. Whitman decided. "And some tea. You need proper nutrition, especially in your condition." When they were finally alone, Isabella sank onto the bed with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. The emotional toll of recent events was catching up with her, the weight of transition and uncertainty pressing down like a physical burden. Samuel knelt beside the bed, his expression tender with concern. "How are you feeling?" "Really feeling, not just what you think I want to hear." Isabella was quiet for a moment, searching for words to express the complex mixture of emotions swirling within her. "Grateful," she said finally. "Overwhelmed, hopeful. Terrified that this is all too good to be true, that I'll wake up tomorrow and find myself back in that barn." Samuel took her hands in his calloused fingers warm and reassuring. "You're not going back, Isabella. Whatever happens from here, whatever challenges we face, you're never going back to that life." "How can you be so certain?" she asked. "You barely know me. You don't know what kind of wife I'll be, what kind of mother. You don't know if I'll be strong enough to build the life you deserve." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her, faced with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Isabella, do you know what I saw when I first met you at that farm?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I saw a woman who was carrying a child under impossible circumstances, working backbreaking labor while pregnant, sleeping with animals, and still fighting to maintain her dignity. I saw someone who could have given up 100 times but chose to keep going because she believed her child deserved better." He paused, his voice growing softer. "That's not weakness, Isabella. That's the strongest thing I've ever witnessed. If you can survive what you've already been through, you can handle whatever comes next." The soup and bread arrived shortly after, carried by a young woman named Molly who worked for Mrs. Whitman. As Isabella ate the first hot meal she had enjoyed in months, she began to feel human again. The simple pleasure of eating from real plates, of sitting in a clean room with her husband beside her, felt like a miracle she was still afraid to fully believe. That night, as they lay together in the comfortable bed, the first they had ever shared, Isabella listened to Samuel's steady breathing and marveled at the transformation of her circumstances. 3 days ago, she had been alone and desperate. Now she was married to a good man who had chosen her despite knowing all her secrets, who saw strength where others saw only shame. The baby stirred restlessly within her, perhaps responding to the stress of travel and change. Isabella placed her hand over the movement, whispering quiet reassurances to the child who would soon enter the world. "Not much longer now, little one," she murmured. "Just a few more weeks, and then you'll be here with us. You'll have a father." who chose you before he ever met you, and a mother who's going to make sure you never doubt that you're wanted and loved. Beside her, Samuel stirred in his sleep, his arm instinctively tightening around her in a gesture of protection that continued even in unconsciousness. For the first time in months, Isabella felt truly safe. The next morning brought the practical challenges of establishing their new life. Samuel set out early to explore employment opportunities, while Isabella rested and began the process of making their rented room feel like home. Mrs. Whitman had provided basic furnishings, but Isabella found herself imagining how they might arrange things when the baby arrived, where a cradle might fit, how they could create a nurturing environment for their growing family. Samuel returned that afternoon with news that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Denver's growing population had created a demand for veterinary services, and he had found a position with an established practice that would allow him to work toward eventually opening his own clinic. Dr. Mitchell has been looking for an assistant for months, Samuel explained, his excitement evident in every word. He's getting older and wants to reduce his workload. If I prove myself over the next year, he's willing to consider making me a partner. Isabella felt tears of relief threatening. That's wonderful news. What kind of salary? Enough to rent a small house by spring, Samuel said, sitting beside her on the bed. Nothing fancy, but our own place with a garden where you could grow vegetables, maybe keep some chickens. The prospect of a garden, of being able to create something beautiful and productive with her own hands, filled Isabella with anticipation. She had inherited her mother's love of growing things, and the idea of nurturing plants as well as her child appealed to something deep within her. There's something else, Samuel continued, his expression growing more serious. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that his wife runs a small school for working women teaching basic literacy, arithmetic, things that might help them find better employment. If you're still interested in improving your reading. Isabella's heart leaped. With possibility, you mean I could actually attend classes? Even with the baby coming? Mrs. Mitchell said they're very accommodating to mothers. Several of their students bring their children to class. Samuel paused, studying her reaction. Would that interest you? Interest me? Isabella laughed, the sound bright with joy. Samuel, that sounds like a dream I never dared to have. Over the following weeks, as January deepened toward February, Isabella began to experience something she had almost forgotten. Contentment. Samuel proved to be everything she had hoped for in a husband, gentle, considerate, genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams. He brought her books from Dr. Mitchell's lending library, read aloud to her in the evenings, and encouraged her fledgling attempts at writing in a journal he had purchased for her. The baby grew more active as the due date approached, responding to Samuel's voice when he spoke to Isabella's belly in the evenings. He had taken to reading veterinary texts aloud, claiming that early exposure to medical terminology would give their child an advantage in life. Listen to this, he would say, one hand resting gently on her swollen stomach while he read from a textbook. The cardiovascular system consists of the heart, blood vessels, and blood itself, working together to transport nutrients throughout the body. Isabella would laugh at his scientific approach to prenatal bonding, but she was touched by his obvious excitement about becoming a father. He had already begun building a cradle in the boarding house's basement workshop, working in the evenings to create something beautiful and sturdy for their child. Mrs. Whitman had proven to be a maternal figure neither of them had expected to find. She checked on Isabella daily, providing advice about pregnancy and childbirth drawn from her own experience as a mother and grandmother. She also shared neighborhood gossip and city news, helping Isabella feel connected to their new community. There's a new library opening next month, Mrs. Whitman mentioned one afternoon as she helped Isabella with some sewing. They're looking for volunteers to help organize the children's section. Might be something you'd enjoy once the baby's old enough. The suggestion opened yet another door to possibilities Isabella had never considered. The idea of working with books and children, of contributing something meaningful to the community, appealed to her growing sense of purpose and belonging. It was on a snowy February morning that Isabella's labor finally began. The contractions started gently, so subtly that she initially dismissed them as the usual discomforts of late pregnancy. But as the morning progressed, the pain intensified into the unmistakable rhythm of childbirth. Samuel had left early for work, but Mrs. Whitman quickly took charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone who had witnessed dozens of births. She sent Molly to fetch Dr. Jameson while she helped Isabella into more comfortable clothing and prepared the room for delivery. "First babies often take their time," Mrs. Whitman said reassuringly as Isabella gripped her hand through a particularly strong contraction. "But this little one seems eager to meet the world." Dr. Jameson arrived within the hour, a kindly man with silver hair and gentle hands who examined Isabella with professional competence. "Everything looks normal," he announced. "Strong, healthy heartbeat. The baby's positioned well. We should have a new citizen of Denver before evening." Samuel returned from work to find their room transformed into a makeshift delivery ward, with Mrs. Whitman and Dr. Jameson providing calm, competent care while Isabella labored with determination that reminded him of her strength in all other circumstances. "How is she?" he asked Dr. Jameson during a quiet moment between contractions. "Doing beautifully," the doctor replied. "Strong as an ox, that wife of yours. The baby's lucky to have such a determined mother." As afternoon faded into evening, Isabella's labor intensified toward its final stages. Samuel held her hand through each contraction, whispering encouragements and reminders of his love. Mrs. Whitman provided cool cloths for her forehead and steady guidance based on her years of experience. "I can see the head," Dr. Jameson announced suddenly. "Just a few more pushes, Mrs. Harrison." Isabella summoned reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, drawing on months of survival and determination to bring her child safely into the world. With a final tremendous effort, she felt the baby emerge into Dr. Jameson's waiting hands. The cry that filled the room was strong and healthy, the sound of a child announcing their arrival with unmistakable vigor. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, Isabella saw Dr. Jameson holding a small, perfect baby with dark hair and tiny fists waving indignantly at the sudden cold. "It's a girl," Dr. Jameson announced with a smile. "A beautiful, healthy daughter." Samuel's face was transformed with wonder and joy as Dr. Jameson placed the cleaned and wrapped baby in Isabella's arms. The child was perfect, tiny but clearly strong, with dark eyes that seemed to focus on her mother's face with surprising alertness. "Hello, little one," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm your mama, and this is your papa. We've been waiting so long to meet you." Samuel reached out with one gentle finger to touch the baby's cheek, his expression soft with awe. "She's perfect, Isabella. Absolutely perfect." "What will you name her?" Mrs. Whitman asked, wiping tears from her own eyes. Isabella looked at Samuel, realizing they had discussed many practical aspects of parenthood, but had never settled on names. "What do you think?" she asked. Samuel considered for a moment, studying the tiny face that was already beginning to seem familiar. "Rose," he said finally. "Like the flowers you want to grow in our garden. Something beautiful that blooms even after harsh winters." "Rose Harrison," Isabella repeated, testing the sound. "I like it. Rosalena Harrison." She added her mother's middle name, a small tribute to the family she had lost but still loved. As Dr. Jameson completed his post-delivery care and Mrs. Whitman tidied the room, Isabella marveled at the tiny person in her arms. Rose had fallen asleep, her small chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. Her fingers curled around Isabella's thumb with surprising strength. "She looks like you," Samuel observed, settling carefully beside them on the bed. Isabella studied her daughter's features, seeing echoes of her own dark hair and Samuel's strong chin. "She looks like herself," she said finally. "Like she knows exactly who she's supposed to be." That night, as they lay together with Rose sleeping peacefully in the cradle Samuel had built, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a different person living a different life, with no idea of the trials and transformations that awaited her. The path had been brutal at times, marked by rejection, humiliation, and despair that had nearly broken her spirit. But it had also led her to Samuel, to love that had grown from mutual respect and shared adversity, to the realization that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. "Thank you," she whispered to Samuel in the darkness. "For what?" he asked softly. "For seeing something worth saving when everyone else saw only shame. For choosing us when you could have chosen safety. For believing we could build something beautiful together." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Isabella, you saved me as much as I saved you. You reminded me that it's possible to love again, to hope again, to believe in the future. Rose isn't just your second chance, she's ours." As dawn broke over Denver, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isabella Harrison looked out the window at the city that had become their home. Somewhere out there was the house they would rent, the garden she would plant, the life they would build together day by day. The summer of 1923, that had begun with such heat and desperation, felt like a lifetime ago. The girl who had been cast out by her family had become a woman who had found her own family, who had discovered that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Rose stirred in her cradle, making the small sounds that would soon demand attention. Isabella rose carefully to tend to her daughter, marveling at how natural motherhood felt. How right it seemed to be responsible for this precious life. As she lifted Rose into her arms, Isabella caught sight of her reflection in the window, a woman holding her child, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt from ruins. The image was powerful in its simple domesticity, a testament to the possibility of redemption and renewal. "Good morning, little Rose," she whispered to her daughter. "Welcome to your new life. It's going to be beautiful." Outside, Denver was waking up to another day of possibility. Inside the boarding house room that had become their temporary haven, the Harrison family was beginning their first full day together, a mother, a father, and a child who represented everything good that could grow from the ashes of heartbreak. The story that had begun with exile and shame had become a tale of love, resilience, and the extraordinary power of human connection to transform even the most desperate circumstances. Isabella Rodriguez, the disgraced daughter, had become Isabella Harrison, the beloved wife and devoted mother. And as the sun climbed higher in the Colorado sky, illuminating a world full of possibility, she knew with absolute certainty that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter of a life she would write herself, surrounded by love and filled with hope for all the tomorrows yet to come. In years to come, when Rose was old enough to ask about her parents' story, Isabella would tell her daughter about courage that bloomed in darkness, about love that grew from kindness, and about the truth that no matter how lost a person might feel, there was always the possibility of finding home in the heart of someone who truly saw them. But for now, in this perfect morning moment, it was enough to hold her daughter close and know that they were all exactly where they belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.